special education surrogate parents at the Federation for Children with Special Needs. Bridget, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bridget Koetsch. I'm also with RTSC. I come to this group as a special education teacher for 23 years, so that's my background and experience.
And an SESP at one time.
Oh, and an SESP.
Okay, a few housekeeping rules. Today's webinar will be, well, as interactive as we can with your putting comments into the Q&A and chat. If you want to share experiences and solutions, we are recording this presentation. Feel free to ask questions anonymously in the chat. Feel free to disable your video. That probably doesn't really apply to us because we're doing a webinar form. And please avoid oversharing by taking anything into the bathroom while video or sound is on. Today's webinar objectives are to talk about what regression means, both academic and the social, emotional, and behavioral regressions that we see in kids, and what recruitment means. To look at how schools measure and address regression in a pre-COVID year, which I've sometimes called more typical, and this year, as far as we know. To look at the DESE guidance, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education guidance on compensatory services and general education services to help kids with recruitment. And then we're going to talk a bit about some of the special concerns about remote learning that may affect your student and how to be sure that your student is receiving the IEP services that they need. We are happy to include discussion about parent, caregiver, and SESP experiences and concerns, which we can do through the chat. Okay, oops, backwards. What is regression? Academic skills regression is defined as a loss of information or skills after a period of interruptions. Typically, we think of it with summer vacations or other long absences from school. Of course, nothing's typical about this year. We expect regression in many students following the summer break. It even has a nickname, the summer slide. We know that students recoup skills at different rates, and that some of our students will not have very much regression at all. Others may have a lot. They may differ between, for example, their English language arts reading and their math. Because of the fact that some students take longer to regain their skills, some special education students receive extended school year services in the summer to try to reduce that regression. Okay. In a before COVID year, what we know from previous school years is that over a summer, student achievement scores tend to decline about a month of learning on average. There are typically greater declines in math than in reading, although there can be significant declines in either one, and it varies by student. Declines tend to be larger at the higher grade levels. And as I said, they're not equal across students. There can be a lot of variation in a classroom. Lower income students may lose more in terms of their achievement scores over the summer. This can also happen with students of color. We've seen in the research that can increase the achievement gaps and make it harder for the student to get going again in the next year. And we don't really know a lot about the impact of having a trauma history on school regression and recruitment, but given that so many of our children who have a trauma history struggle with things like executive function, attention, I think it's to be expected that our kids who have been through traumatic experiences will probably suffer quite a lot from regression. So what will regression look like in 2020? Nobody is sure. We have had a really unprecedented 6 months of interruption in our in-person learning. The variables in terms of how a given student is going to do will involve, for example, what model of the education their school adopts in this year, whether they're hybrid or fully remote, the quality of the remote education that they get this year and how much the student can be engaged, as well as what they were able to do in the spring, given the quality of that education. The student's ability to access the remote learning, how inequitable access and absenteeism is addressed, because we may see schools taking a very hard line on absenteeism, and we need to be very vigilant that they are not overly penalizing our kids because of it. we're looking for prevention, basically, when we're talking about how to re-engage students with the class, keep them engaged, as opposed to taking a truancy approach and potentially getting into court involvement. It's likely that that line was there twice, okay. It's likely that our kids of low income, our vulnerable students, our kids with disabilities, the children who have SESPs assigned to them are going to experience a greater level of regression. Okay. So in a typical year, teachers evaluate students in the first weeks of school. They do benchmark assessments, and they use that information and what they're seeing in the classroom to guide the instruction and create targeted lessons to look at areas of weakness. We're not able to do that to a great extent now, even where the students are in hybrid education. They're not going to be in class as much. So it's likely that remote assessments and remote learning are going to be an important part of trying to figure out regression. And this is going to vary by district, by student, by teacher, how this is going to be implemented. We know that remote assessments to look at achievement scores can be done typically over or virtual remotely. We don't think about assessments that are for diagnosis, such as special education assessments, as typically being done remotely because they are not what's called normed for use in a remote setting. The tests were developed in person with thousands and thousands of children taking these tests, and that created the normal curve, the bell curve, that is used to compare the test to. So you really can't compare a student who takes a test in a different mode, like online, with kids who took it in person. So for that reason, a lot of tests have been held up for special education assessments. But we know that remote assessments, even if they're not normed, and they typically would be, they give us information, and that can be used to look at progress over time. DESE has been very clear that parent input is going to be very, very critical. And this is going to be an interesting situation for the SESPs to try to navigate because, of course, you're not with a student all day long, as a typical parent would be. You're going to need to have a lot of input from the group home or residents as much as possible to understand how the student learned when they were taking remote education last spring and how they're doing now with remote education, what they're being offered, what they're able to access, and how they're doing with it when they can. We've seen some special education progress reports that came out in the spring that had very rosy outlooks that may not have agreed with what the parents are seeing. You know, students doing fine, students making progress. Not a lot of information, unfortunately, for schools to really base those on. And so they have to be provided by the people who are with the student, whether it's the parent or the group home, with the SESP serving as the conduit to get that information to the team. Any information that you can get from the group home or from your own conversations with the student or with the school about how the student did in the spring and how they're doing this fall, even if it's anecdotal, is going to be helpful, and you want to get it in writing to this team. Bridget, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I did. I was trying to find my mouse. Yes, so it's hard for the school in particular to create the progress report. At times it could be because some of the programming that was done in the spring was online. Lexia had a program, there were certain online components, and parents were, just to be assistive, were helping the students sort of answer some of the questions to move along if they, you know, hit a frustration point. So some of the results and the data that was collected was inflated because of the assistance that was given. So some of your progress reports could say making growth when really it's mom or dad or whoever the caregiver is was helping, you know, assist in answering those things. So it can be a false positive.
Yeah, and we know that a lot of group homes required students to be supervised while they were doing their online learning, and any assessments were done online, and they may have equally been tempted to help. Recoupment is when we regain lost skills and information after the school interruption. DESE interprets recoupment as if a child's having a lot of trouble catching up, it's an aspect of significant regression, and that can trigger extended school year services. Specifically, the significant regression and recoupment The factors that they look at are a loss of performance level that was attained before the break in service, the learning rate of the child and whether it's limited in a way that lengthens the amount of time that the student needs to review and relearn the previous material, and the fact that the time that it takes for the child to accomplish this recruitment is greater than the period of time that the school district would typically see for other students to review and relearn, and that the teacher would spend on the review and relearning. So we have a link here for you that is for questions and answers in special education for extended school year programs that really describes how this is assessed. It's a good way to look at how recruitment can be measured in general, and it's good information to have as background. We know that our kids have had social, emotional, and behavioral regression. COVID has been very, very tough for people of all ages. In typical regression for younger children, children can revert to an earlier stage in development. This is a normal part of childhood. I think anyone who has parented a young child has probably seen them take steps back when they're communicating a distress or a stress, frustration, things that are going on with them. These can be traumatic events, but it can also be things that are normal life events that are big changes, like moving, being separated from a parent, changes in routine. And in younger children, we can see things like tantrums, refusing to engage in schoolwork, toileting accidents, baby talk, intense, unpredictable emotions, being more clingy, being a whole lot more activated, having trouble sleeping, all kinds of things. And it's usually a stage that kids go through and are able to recover from. We also see this in older kids. We think about regression behaviorally with younger kids, but teenagers can revert to an earlier stage of development too. Teenagers can need a lot of reassurance, and it can be tough because they can be so internal and quiet, particularly if they're anxious and worried. They may keep their concerns inside. Some teenagers have that sense of invincibility. That's normal brain development, which seems to be an interesting stage that they go through, where it's a feeling of basically not having a sense of mortality, things like that. It's not a great combination when you add it to quarantine fatigue, where everybody's so tired of following these rules, and a sense of rebellion that kids may have against following the safety rules. So we can expect to see some behaviors in the classroom, in the group home. If they're engaging online, there may be, increased areas of difficulty or pushback from teenagers. We know for all of our kids that they may be afraid to go physically to school or to see other people. They may have, even with the precautions that are put in place, they may not feel safe. Kids can be afraid that something is going to happen to them, to their families, to their caregivers. We just really have to be very conscious of their mental health needs, even more than usual, because we know that many students are feeling anxious and depressed, many adults too. There's been data that came out of the CDC a couple of weeks ago showing a great increase in the number of young adults who have seriously considered suicide in the past month. We are hearing anecdotal reports about kids going to emergency rooms with suicide attempts. So I think it's going to take some time for this data to really emerge, but we're living through a crisis, a mental health crisis for our kids. And so we really have to be vigilant about making sure our kids get the services that they need. And for SCSPs, this means communicating a lot with the group home about behaviors that you're seeing there as well as in school, because it may be that the services that can be put in place in the school, including things like teletherapy, or put in outside through the DCF social worker, could be really helpful. Changes that you would look for is increases in irritability, being tired all the time, having trouble sleeping, which one can lead to the other, trouble concentrating. All of these things can be related to anxiety and depression. And we're going to talk about the guidance that came out of DESE about compensatory services and new services. New disability evaluations can occur for emotional and behavioral needs if the student doesn't already have an IEP, or if they have an IEP for some other category. The child doesn't need to have an IEP to get those kinds of evaluations. Bridget, would you like to take this one? You
Yes.
touched on it.
I did. I touched on this when the teacher's doing remote assessments or when your child is doing working independently. The adult supervising should not assist the student in completing assignments, and that can be very tough to walk away. But we do want it to be a true reflection of what your student is capable of doing. I think sometimes what needs to happen now more than ever is for you to be able to communicate with the school staff, with the teacher, and say, you know what, Timmy worked on this for 20 minutes. It caused so much frustration. I had him stop. That is absolutely within your purview to be able to say, he stopped. You can write a note on something, shoot an email or a text, however you're communicating with your school. Let them know right away, this was over their head. If you wait, it sort of compounds things for you and for your student. So give them a stop point when you hear the kettle bubbling, but also and you can ask the teacher, if this is intended as an assessment with no help at all, completely independent, then you want to be able to walk away. But if it's independent work that is not assessment driven, then you want to be able to stop the task and let the teachers know.
And I think for SCSPs, it's important to communicate with your team leader about when assessments are being done as much as possible, and make sure that information is getting to the group home, because they're going to need support there and the structure of not being helped with the test.
Right.
Okay. We have a lot of concerns, of course, from the spring. We had a what was the expression? Building the cart while it's speeding down the hill. Start to remote learning. But that is not what the expectation is for this fall. DESE has been very clear that kids are to receive their full 170 days of education this year, which amounts to 850 hours in the elementary schools and 935 for the middle and high schools, which is a 5 to 5.5 hour school day for our kids. That's an awful lot of remote learning. I don't know about you guys, but if I spend 5 or 5.5 hours on Zoom meetings, I'm fried by the end of the day. So we know that all districts are doing either hybrid or fully remote learning, because even districts that have opted to have fully in-person learning need to have a backup in case they have children quarantined. In fact, out of, I think it was 498 districts in the state that reported in August what their plans were, 8 of them said they were going to fully in-person learning. And those are small, isolated districts, places like Truro. So the expectation that we're facing with most districts is that we will either be hybrid or starting fully remote and maybe going hybrid later. So you've probably already had to face this, but parents and SCSPs are expected to make the decision about the programming that the student receives, whether they are hybrid or fully in-person learning, depending on what the district is offering. Bridget?
I'm just going to say to slow down, because
you.
our interpreter has requested that we slow down.
Thank you. I apologize.
That's okay.
We know that some districts are not offering any in-person choices. Some districts are offering limited in-person choices. So depending on what your district is willing to do, some districts have said you can't switch back and forth between models. DESE's expectation is that you can switch, but there may be a period of transition of up to a month. So we have yet to see how that will play out. Our kids who are in foster care and in group homes, those with significant and complex special needs, are among the kids who have priority for in-person education. So some of our students may be going 5 days or 4 days a week, depending on the model in the school. If there is a choice, the educational decision maker, be it parent, grandparent, other caregiver, or SASP, has the legal right to make the choice. But that is something that has to be worked out, obviously, with the group home, if for SCSPs. All of the districts seem to have different plans. We have 520 something different entities that have submitted plans to DESE, and they're all different in terms of what level they are. Starting out with in-person education, many districts are leaning toward preschool and early elementary grades, if anybody goes, and really avoiding having the high school kids go, because they are much closer to adult in size and more likely to be susceptible to catching COVID. We know that no matter what the model is, all of you, whether you're a parent, a caregiver, an SESP, working with the group home staff, you all have a really important role to play this fall and probably through 2020-2021 school year in monitoring that remote learning and how much the students are able to access it. Bridget, tell me if I speed up again.
I will.
I was born in New York and I talk quickly.
I'm monitoring the chat. We have some questions, but we have about 2 slides to go and then we can hop on to questions.
Sounds good. Okay, so what are some concerns that we need to think about? Does the family or the group home have enough computers or tablets? This is a big one for a lot of districts, and for some group homes, there may not be enough actual devices. Families who have multiple children learning at home on different schedules may have kids who have activities at the same time of day, and they don't have enough computers. Some districts have worked really hard to get so that every child has a device, but some districts still have gaps, so it's something that we need to figure out. It is the expectation of DESE that the districts will be figuring this out and providing the equipment, but they have to know there's a problem. We need to know if the family or the group home has reliable internet access. And in the case of group homes, if they have internet access, do they have protocols for allowing the students to use it? Do they have to be supervised? And if they are supervised, do they have the staff to do that for all of the students who need to be learning in the home? We have run into so many families that have had problems with accessing multiple systems. One might be on the Google Teach and one might be on the Zoom, and at different times at different formats. This can be really confusing for adults, sometimes less so for the kids, but if they can't explain it to us, we need to figure it out with the schools. Are we comfortable with working with its technology that the kids need, or are group home staff comfortable with doing it? If people need to have some help in understanding and supervising the education, this is something that can be added to the IEP. There is a section of the IEP in the service delivery grid which mentions consults, and it says right on the page that the consults are for staff and parents, and in lieu of parents, it could be SASPs or group home staff who could be getting the consultations on how to help the students engage. So it's an important thing to talk about with your team if it's something that you need. You can get the consult support for the adult who's going to be helping the child with. And as we talked about, are there time limits to access computers in group homes, staffing? What are the issues? You need to figure those out. Bridget, would you mind taking a moment and giving the anecdote of your student that you worked with as an SESP?
Sure. I had a student who was in a group home, and I reached out to her at the start of COVID and said, so how's schoolwork going? She said, the packets are boring. I don't really like it. And I said, oh, do you have your computer there for the online? Because I knew her school was doing that. And she said, no, I don't have a device. So I got in touch with the districts that were involved, and we got a device to her. I drove a device to her. The next week I called to see how she was doing, and she said, they don't let us online. Would have been good information to have a couple weeks prior, but I went and sent out emails and said, so what's the deal with no internet allowed? And was told that they were working on it and they got it fixed, and she got internet. And then she was able to access her curriculum when I explained that they were impeding her FAPE. So
it's a problem that we've heard about from a number of SASPs in spring, and we're hoping it's better this fall. But you know, with COVID, there's been an awful lot of changes in the group homes, and sometimes they happen very quickly, where students have to be moved quickly, and so that can lead to confusion, misunderstandings, changes in staff, which kind of compound the problem. Okay. When our kids are in school, we know that it's going to look different. Any student who takes any bus is required to wear a mask. Bus windows have to be open, except in the most extreme weather. There's a lot of rules around the bus. They are looking for bus monitors to try to get the kids to comply with the spacing rules and the mask rules. The bus driver has a bottle of hand sanitizer, but they have to hang on to it so the students don't get it. A lot of rules. We know that in schools, the adults and all children grades 2 and up are required to wear masks. Younger children are encouraged to wear masks, and they must stay at least 3 feet apart. This picture is actually not a very good one because she's much too close to that student. Of course, our students with disabilities who can't tolerate masks, our students with communication disabilities, our students with autism who may have trouble with reading social cues and facial cues. These are all situations where wearing a mask is even more difficult, and it's possible to use face shields in that kind of situation. For students who really can't tolerate a mask and who need their caregiver very close in the school, there's a whole protocol that DESE has set out involving a lot of personal protective equipment for the caregiver. Classroom windows remain open, which is going to be interesting when it gets cold. We know that kids may experience anxiety and isolation through all these safety protocols, particularly kids who are already anxious. It can be frightening. It can be disorienting to be in that kind of situation. So it's going to be a challenge for everybody to try to learn how to learn in these situations.
Okay,
question time.
So I'm going to go through and read our questions so that they can be translated. Our first question is from a person who was an SESP, a special ed surrogate parent for a child in residential home care. He started substantially separate day school this spring. She had been told that the DCF worker was the proper person to give permission for the in-person learning or the remote learning. And that directive, and I know it's confusing, we just sort of solidified it through, I believe it was through DCF, that the SESP is the decision maker. So you may have been told before that it was DCF, but what we're being told right now, and again, it's guidances that are coming from everywhere. Everyone's trying to, get quick and accurate information, but it is the SESP who would make that decision of where the education takes place.
I mean, DCF determines the child's residence. The SESP determines the child's educational placement. But in terms of how they access that placement, it was a gray area. But we have heard from Jim Morrison, who had the educational arm of DCF and supervises all the education coordinators, that in fact the SESP is the decision.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next. This person is asking us to repeat what you said about there being a 1-month period of transition into one of the models. So let's let it get translated before and I think I know what this is referring to.
Go ahead then.
Possibly, but if I don't, and you're the one that asked this question, drop it in the chat. So some schools are sort of slow boating their reentry and starting with 1 day in, and then the next week they'll have 2 days in. So it can take a while to get the full, their full plan in place because they're taking sort of a slower progression. I'm hoping that that was the question that you asked. Let me see if you added anything in. Okay, I have a couple of more. What do you do about a school that is only opening 4 days a week for in-person when virtual learning is a trigger? So only open for 4 days, virtual learning is a trigger. It's part of communication with and I'm not completely sure I completely understand the question, but it is part of staying in touch and communicating with the district and having those conversations with guidance, the guidance department, and looking to see if all aspects of the IEP are in place that will help support your student.
I'm understanding it as there's a 5th day that the student is not able to access because they can't access remote education. I would take this question directly to the team and the teachers and try to figure out ways that the student can access education if being on the computer is
Right. If it could be a printed product.
if there's something
Mhm.
else the student could do in that
Right.
day.
Because I know many schools are doing Wednesday is online for everyone. If they're doing 2 cohorts, and some kids are able to participate in all 4. Another question, what can be done for a child who is nonverbal and is in a district that has decided on remote learning? Same for children who cannot access the curriculum during remote learning. And that is we're in tough times and unprecedented times, and that's, I would ask the district what they have for family and community supports, and if they have a family and community support point person that can assist with getting services in the home.
A nonverbal child would be considered significant and complex needs. And DESE has been clear that those students should be prioritized for in-person services, even if the district is fully remote. And if the school buildings aren't open, that perhaps community buildings could be used if they're not willing to send somebody into the home. The guidance does say that they're really very clear that there is no shortcut on FAPE this fall. We are to have our services delivered. So it's a matter of working with the district to figure out how they're going to do that. Shall we go on, or do you have another question?
How will the open windows change in the winter? I think that the theory is that it will be out of COVID before the snow falls. And so they've only made plans for the first couple of months in the school year. And that is an absolutely valid question. I was wondering it myself. And so I think they're trying to keep hope alive, and we'll address it soon.
I think there's a lot of, there's a sense that things are very fluid. There's a fear, of course, that going back to school in person might cause increases in our COVID rates, that when we combine that with flu season, we may not be in school when it gets really cold until we have the vaccine. It's just not clear how it's going to play out. I don't think the open window has been given a lot of thought, honestly.
Right.
I mean, what worries me is, I had kids who wouldn't wear their coats. There are kids who don't have good coats.
Right.
You know, it's a real equity issue too, and to expect them to sit in the classroom freezing and still learn. But of course, a lot of older school buildings especially have really poor HVAC systems. So they can't do good air circulation without the window.
So in a attempt to sort of respect everyone's time, it's 1:05. I think we go until 1:30. We do have a section coming up on compensatory services specifically that will be speaking to that. Other questions about, all of the concerns we all have, please feel free, and I'll put a link in, to reach out to the Federation and the Information Center for support. If you're an SESP, please reach out to Eileen, myself, and Mary Beth. But I will put a link in from our website. And these are absolutely valid questions. I just sort of want to respect our intent for today on regression and compensation. And yes, we're going to be going to a different session.
Great.
All right.
And if anyone puts a question into the chat that we don't have time to answer, we're saving the chat and we will try to get back to you. Okay, so what guidance have we had from DESE in terms of compensatory services? This was hotly awaited and interesting. This is a link that will take you right to all the guidance. Oops, I didn't do that right. That's okay. So what we know, the key words here for this year are document and communicate. And you'll hear us say those over and over. For the student who has an IEP, we know that very likely they didn't get all their services delivered in the spring, or not in the way that they should have been, both in frequency and in the style of delivery. So your information, or the group home's information on how the child did with remote learning, whether it's triggering to them, whether they're able to engage, is really critical to the team and has to be considered. So this is where documenting comes in. We encourage SESPs, parents, group homes to document everything going forward, and also impressions and thoughts about the spring if they haven't already documented. And that needs to be shared with the team in writing. There are paper and pencil tools, there are online tools to manage notes on all kinds of issues around remote learning, any signs of difficulty, any signs of progress or regression. If the student is having trouble with attending to online learning, if they can't engage with the computer, if it's, as we said, triggering, you need to let the school know. School needs to know, and it needs to be communicated about often, because the onus is on the school to figure out a way to engage with the student. Okay, this is an example of a daily log that I just made up for an example of how you could break out a day. Now, this is broken out for a typical high school day, so about 5.5 hours. And just look at, what time was the lesson, how long was the lesson, what format was it in, and then how did the student participate? Were they engaged? Were they listening? Were they banging their head on the desk? And notes about things that helped or didn't help with it. That kind of record will make a huge difference for teams in documenting how your student is doing. And I know that's a lot to ask of a group home to do that for all of the students, but it's really critical information to help them get extra services. DESE has given us 3 basic categories for compensatory services. The first is what they're calling general education recovery support. That's available to all students, whether or not they have disabilities, to address their educational, social, and emotional needs and reorient them to learning. We typically expect some regression from kids over a summer. So obviously with a 6-month interruption in learning, we've got an expectation that most students will have some regression. So the school will be putting things into place. They also have COVID-19 compensatory services, or CCS. This is a new category for students with IEPs to remedy their skill or knowledge loss or lack of effective progress due to not being able to access their IEP services. This is really important to look at the distinction. And I'll say this again, we're going to go into some more detail about each of these, but it's not just regression here. For kids who have IEPs, they are expected to make progress, and if they are not able to make progress toward their IEP goals, whether or not they have regressed further academically, they are entitled to those COVID compensatory services. And of course, new IEP services, which we discussed before in the context of kids who are having mental health concerns to address new areas of disability. And it doesn't have to be just mental health. It could be that a caregiver who's watching a student doing math sees how much they're struggling with the math and asks for math evaluations. So these are all important areas for potential services. Interesting. I done. Okay. Oh no, sorry. 1 second. Okay. So for general education recovery support, we're looking at things that the school can do for all students, such as academic scaffolding, making different accommodations, differentiating their instruction. Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions are part of the response to intervention, RTI kind of learning that targets demonstrated academic need. Tier 1 is what everybody gets. Tier 2 is looking to prevent new problems and doing group instruction. Tier 3 tends to be much more individualized. Kids can get interventions not just for academics, but for behavioral support. Behavioral plans, counseling, other emotional needs. Social and emotional issues are going to be a big question mark with kids going back with masks on and all of those social distancing measures, or not going back at all and being remote. Kids who are going back are going to need help around the health and safety protocols. I think a lot of us have gotten used to using masks, but it can still be challenging to wear them for really long periods of time. Passing in the hallway, how do they use the restroom, what are their different, hand washing and disinfecting things that they have to do. Bridget, you had a suggestion about mask wearing.
Oh, I did. Well, it wasn't my suggestion, but it's genius. So I saw on Facebook, where I get all of my great information, that someone decided to help to increase tolerance of face masks by tying it into technology. So if a child wanted to play on the Wii or play on their iPad, they had to wear their face mask during that time. So you take a preferred activity and you put in a non-preferred and you match them together. And that seems to be working for many of my families.
It's to help them get used to wearing the mask without necessarily thinking about wearing the mask.
Right.
And of course, positive behavior interventions and supports in the schools are a very well recognized way to try to approach behavioral issues. COVID compensatory services for kids with IEPs. There needs to be a team meeting to discuss whether the child needs COVID compensatory services, and this meeting needs to be held by December 15th. So our recommendation is that you write to the district and ask for a meeting sooner rather than later. It's not like they're going to do them all on December the 14th. So they need to be getting them done, and let's get the services in. December 15th is a really long time from now in terms of how long the kids have been missing their services.
Right.
It's not necessarily, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bridget.
I would err on the side of not thinking that no news is good news. This is sort of where we have to be more proactive, particularly with the December 15th date. So if right now you are curious to know if your child has regressed, if you see you have a thought that maybe they're not doing what they should be doing or where they should be, ask for a program review IEP meeting, just to kind of get and say, I'm concerned about regression.
And then, ask them. The team needs to decide on COVID compensatory services. Mm-hmm. Now, the CCS, these services are not a one-to-one correspondence to missed IEP services. So if your student had missed 8 sessions of speech and language, it's not like they're going to automatically be assigned another 8 sessions of speech and language. It's going to be individualized, and it's going to be following a determination based on questions. First of all, are there services in the IEP that were not offered to the student or that the student could not access during the period of suspended in-person education? So since last March. And to what extent has the student demonstrated regression in their skills? And has the student failed to make effective progress toward their IEP goals and in the general curriculum? Now, that third point is very different from what we've seen in the past, and it's very important to remember that it's not just whether the student has regressed or whether they missed a certain number of speech and language or whatever sessions. It's how are they doing in making effective progress. The fourth point the team considers is, does the school have available general education recovery support? That's the first kind that Desi mentioned, to support the student, and is that going to be sufficient? Finally, we talked about new IEP services to address new areas of disability, whether it's the mental health issues, anxiety, anything like that, or any other kinds of disabilities that may have been noticed. And we have a sample letter here that's attached with a hyperlink that can show you an example of how to write a letter to the district if that's something that you haven't had a chance to do before. Basically, specifically, you're asking for an evaluation. I request evaluation for this reason, for these areas. Regular timelines apply, according to Desi, which means that after we ask for our evaluation, we have 5 days to make the decision to send the consent to evaluate. And once they've received the consent to evaluate, the school has 30 days to do the evaluations, and then another 15 days in which to schedule a meeting to discuss those evaluations, for a total of 45 days from the point at which they received the signed consent. Those are school days. So regular timelines, everything that's written in law is expected to be followed this fall. Gonna be interesting. Schools can provide behavior intervention plans for students, particularly designed to target behavioral problems, and these can be something that can come following a functional behavioral assessment. Once there's a behavior intervention plan, that should be included in the IEP, not all the details of the plan, but the fact that it exists, because once that's in the IEP, That is part of what has to be followed legally, and it is part of what comes into consideration of discipline problems if things escalate and the student gets into trouble. Okay, more questions?
So let's see, we have some in the chat. There are about 4 more slides after this question section that may address some of these, but let's get into it.
Can we go ahead and then do questions?
So I wanted people to know that you'll be getting a copy of this presentation with the active links, because some had wanted to know that journal sort of logging things. And so that will be provided.
That's just an example too. I mean, I just whipped that up in Excel in about 5 minutes. And whatever, I think it's important to be able to individualize it to the students.
Right.
Because if you know a student has issues where they like, won't sit still for watching the online class, or they have more trouble with asynchronous learning where they're getting things recorded. These are all important things to factor into what questions you ask in those little journals.
I think one thing that I know that we don't really discuss, I want to see if there's compensatory. Our compensatory services provided only in the case of regression. Can compensatory be provided in cases where progress was not as much as you believed would have happened in the services had been provided?
Absolutely.
So that's where calling that meeting in a progress review, because really at this time it's hard to tweak out, you know, what the reason is, but we've had a 6-month delay of in-person education. One thing I would like to say is that I don't believe we're addressing it, is if your student has accommodations that they require to make effective progress in school in the building, then those accommodations are required in the kitchen during schooling. An example of that could be child needs a different seat, one of the bounce ball seats or a flex seat. And you can email the school and say, you know, gee, when could I pick up my child's, you know, iPad? Or more so it would be noise canceling headphones are completely different than regular headphones and make a huge difference in helping kids attend to online learning. So looking at your PLEP A and your PLEP B and additional information pages of that IEP will help to see what accommodations, specific types of lined paper. If you don't have access to that at home, then again, email the school. When can I pick up the, you know, the accommodations that are listed on my child's IEP? Did all these guidelines apply to students with disabilities in DOIS facilities? Yes. If you're on an IEP, these guidelines apply. All right.
Zoe?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We know that there are, of course, a lot of concerns about ongoing remote learning. The biggest one that comes to the top is student engagement. We know that about a quarter of Boston Public Schools students never got online in the spring. There was a survey that showed that students in lower income households were much less likely to be engaged in remote learning once a week or less, or to be engaged in all. Kids not having consistent access to a device, or the parents reporting that remote learning is going poorly. These are much more common in households with lower incomes. So it's worth thinking about, particularly in terms of access for families that might need some extra support. We really strongly suggest that you communicate as much as you can with the teachers, with the school team lead, probably more than you would even in a normal year. There are questions you can ask about school starting and about how it's going. We have a list of questions about school reopening on the Federation website. I'm not going to go through all of them in consideration of time, but you can ask things about what the schedule will be. Of course, request a meeting to discuss the progress in last spring and regression, to talk about safety procedures, and what can you, even as the SASP who's not living with the student, do to help make that year more successful. It's going to be an interesting year. For navigating the IEP meeting, we know that IEP meetings are being held virtually now. So you want to be prepared in advance to access the meeting. I actually just had a Zoom call last night with 2 friends who had never used Zoom. Go ahead, Bridget.
So in regards to that, prepare in advance to access the meeting, that would be if you've never Zoomed or done the Google Meet or whatever platform your district is using. When you get that invite, contact them and say, the day before, could someone meet with me online to walk me through, so that your attention is on the content of the meeting and not the platform of the meeting. And most districts are more than happy to accommodate that.
As we always do, we want all the documents in advance of the meeting as much as possible, particularly anything that you have to read in detail and ask questions about, like copies of evaluations, which you can get 48 hours before the meeting, any data that's going to be discussed. It's a good idea to draft out your parent and student concerns ahead of time and share it with the IEP team. Go back through the prior IEPs and make a list of the priorities that you think are the most important given COVID and remote and hybrid learning, and what do they need to discuss first, and really document anything that happened in the spring and summer and any regression that was observed by you or by the group home.
Okay. That's our last slide before our thank you, I believe.
Well, we'll say thank you, and then we'll answer some questions.
Yes. So there's a great question that came in, and it's, after submitting an outside neuropsych eval to school, how long should I wait for the next school team meeting to review it? I believe there's a 10-day timeline. When you have submitted evaluations, there's 10 days for them to convene a team and talk about these evaluations. That is right now my understanding. So that's what I'm going with. Do you have, does that make sense? Does that sound right to you, Eileen?
I'd need to check it, but
Okay.
yeah, there's definitely a timeline attached to that, and it needs to be followed this year without exception.
Right.
Okay.
The next
Robin
second
raised
part.
her hand. I wonder if she has an answer to that.
Okay. Where is Robin? I'll allow you to talk. Robin. She might have had a question.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to go on to the next question here, which is, if my child moved to an out-of-district placement this summer, can I still ask for COVID-related compensatory services? So what the directive was that came down is, yes, your current placement should invite the previous school to attend the meeting. One is the program determination, one is the finance determination now. So it became, it's within the regulations, and I will try to find it, and I will write down your name and get you that part of the regulation, because it popped into my head. So you go to X school, they left Y school. X school invites Y school to attend. They discuss whether compensatory services are needed. Y school is financially responsible for that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Robin.
Okay,
welcome
hi,
to
I'm
the
Robin
show.
Delagestina. I'm actually a school psychologist in Massachusetts. So the answer to that last question is 10 school days.
Yes.
They have to review.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
No problem.
All right, so now let's look into the chat and see what questions we have. Let's see. Someone had asked me to repeat the tolerance of mask wearing. I did put it in the chat, but it's to combine a preferred activity with the mask wearing, which could be non-preferred activity. So if they're playing the Wii or Switch, then require them to wear the mask for 10 minutes of that time.
Another thing that you can do with kids that might be most effective with younger children, but there are social stories about wearing masks that you can watch with them, read with them, and we have some of those listed on our website.
Okay. Another is, if the district is providing in-person to some students with disabilities and states they will only provide to others who have complex needs, only if they have space or transportation, is that acceptable? That is not acceptable. If your child, in looking at their IEP and the amount of hours that time they would be spent out of the classroom to receive their services, they are a complex need child. Transportation, if it's in your IEP that they need to provide transportation, then the school will be providing transportation. Again, I had put the link in for the federations, but it's on our homepage, fcsn.org, to get specific help from our call center, information center. Next question is, if the child has lost services due to running and COVID, are they entitled to compensatory services?
Running?
I'm not sure what that means. A lot of people are in agreement with the 10 days, 10 school days. Thank you very much.
Running in COVID, meaning they bolted from a group home and were runaway?
Oh, I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to that. And again, I would rather than make up an answer, I would say if you can reach out to Federation's Information Center.
Yeah, we can try to find you the answer. I haven't heard of that one.
Another question is, I'm wondering about functional behavioral assessments and how DESE is telling districts to conduct those, both when regarding a behavior that was of concern before March 2020 and regarding behaviors that have seen through learning at home and remotely. So FBAs, I believe, can be done in the home. I know they can be done in congregate care homes. But you're right, a functional behavior assessment is, I have a behavior that I want someone to come in and focus their attention on. But if it's a behavior that is during a whole class and we don't have any whole classes, then the variables are all changing right now. But I believe a conversation with your team, if it is, like I said, if there's, I know that in most districts, if not all, there's a community and outreach specialist or someone who has that hat. And I would reach out to the school and ask, I need home supports and I need someone to have eyes on the boots on the ground, so to speak.
And it is the expectation that evaluations will be carried out, including the diagnostic evaluations that are done to determine eligibility for special education. It's a difficult problem, but private groups that do those, those out-of-pocket evaluations that are done independently are functioning. I mean, they have done things like do assessments outdoors, and I know NESCA cut a hole in the wall and put up plexiglass and a sound system so that the student is not in the same room with the evaluator,
Right.
but they're looking at each other. There are ways around this. So the schools need to be doing that. They need to be catching up on their
But for an FBA,
evaluations.
it's a different bird.
Yeah, no, but I just thought I'd mention that because I know a lot of people were waiting on evaluation.
Another question, as you said, schools are in chaos and behind or building the cart as it starts going down the hill. What if schools don't respond to emails or to parents' requests? What should parent do next? I would question who you're reaching out to. And if you haven't heard from someone, then you kind of have to keep moving up the food chain until you get a response. I also say when I'm emailing the special ed director, I always include the special ed director's assistant or office administrator, because they can at times assist with all of this.
And if you're emailing your team leader, are you copying the principal? You work your way up the chain. And I also don't think that schools are necessarily in the chaos now that they were back in March and April. I think that the expectation is that things will be provided in a more routine manner, slightly more routine. So you should be getting answers to your emails, no question. And it may be as simple as a problem with an email. There have been times when I've called the school secretary and said, I've been trying to get a hold of so-and-so and I'm having trouble. Could you please let them know?
Okay, another question. I'm working in a district who is not following guidelines, and PRS complaints have seemed to give the district a pass because of COVID. What should be the next steps? I guess it depends on what guidelines they're not following and collecting all of your data to support with evidence of what your concerns are within your district.
And PRS complaints before this school year may be handled differently
than right now,
and how they're handled going forward, because schools have been put on notice that they are not to, be doing this. And another thing that's important to mention is we have heard stories of districts that are asking parents to sign a waiver, signing away special education rights, both private schools and public school districts. No.
and that was in the spring, and I think they've
Yes,
all been. They've all had their.
Recently heard about a case in a private school. So just be vigilant. If anybody tells you you have to sign away any special education rights to get your student services, no, you do not.
So one comment is, please note some districts are still trying to hire staff. Absolutely. This is, I always want to put the foot forward of we're all on the side of the student. Our job as advocates, our job as parents is to put our kids' case in the front of the line. But once we get there, we're all part of the same team, and districts are trying their best. I have friends with many teachers, and the work that is being done is incredible.
And you know, when you think about it, we're asking all of our teachers to work in a higher risk environment than they ever signed up for.
Right.
And a lot of teachers are not doing that, you know, taking leaves, changing professions. So yeah, it's been a real crisis for a lot of districts to hire people.
Having said that, it is not an excuse to not provide your child with what your child needs.
Okay.
So I think that is, we're at 1:33.
Well, I think we will say goodbye.
Thank you all so much for participating in this, and I hope you found it helpful. You can access our other webinars, and like I said, SESPs, please reach out to myself or Eileen or Mary Beth.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.